Today's episode, we're going to dive into the roots of Dadaism, and then we're going to talk about the future and where I think internet culture as a whole is heading. Head into 2026 and do not follow trends, but rather set them for yourself. Brands were launching 30% more content this year than ever before. So it really doesn't matter anymore if you can just churn out a bunch of quick pieces of creative. It's not going to ultimately get you very far. This is the recipe book for how I saw a lot of wins in 2025. I love working with Pilot House because while we are a performance marketing agency, we really pride ourselves on caring so much about brand and creative. At Pilot House, we don't just make ads, we craft them. Every edit, every word, every scroll-stopping detail is built with purpose and care, and I truly believe that care drives creativity and creativity drives results. Our attention to both scale and brand allows us to craft strategies that deliver you short-term results while making you long-term successful, which is so important for any DTC brand. If you are curious about learning more about working with Pilot House, you can fill out a lead form at pilothouse.co and let them know you want to go on a brand new ad venture. You don't actually have to say that. You don't have to make a pun. I'm not going to force you to make a pun. Just fill out the lead form. We'd love to chat with you. Hi, welcome back to Ad-venturous, the podcast produced by DTC and hosted by me, Aves. Today I have what is, I think, maybe one of my favorite episodes ever. I had so much fun preparing my notes for this episode and just thinking about it, and I feel like I'm going to have just as much fun recording it, so I am rearing to go. I'm very excited. I feel like part of the excitement is the sheer volume of Christmas cookies I have been eating and baking. It is getting to be a little bit absurd. I feel like I'm running on sugar and peppermint and gingerbread, and I love that. That's exactly the state I think I should be in if I'm going to talk about Dadaism and modern internet culture. But yeah, I don't feel like we need much of an intro. I'll sort of set the stage again in case you missed the episode last week. We're doing a 3-part series. This is number 2. The goal of this series is to help you guys figure out how to be the most relevant and the most exciting you can be from a brand and creative strategy point of view heading into 2026. Last week, we talked about a more tactical tool to use, which was a message box, which is a framework I use all the time. And I wanted to start there and start with a conversation about the idea of omnipresent brand sort of taking over in the wake of the death of the millennial brand, because I wanted to sort of set the stage as to where we mostly are at this moment in time. Today's episode, we're going to dive into both the past, so we're going to talk about the roots of Dadaism, and then we're going to talk about the future and where I think internet culture as a whole is heading. And then next week, we're going to talk about Norman Rockwell, and we're going to talk about the convergence of advertising and art and how it gives us a snapshot in history and what our snapshot might look like at this exact point in time. So the setup of today's episode, like I mentioned, we're going to talk about people over 100 years ago starting an art movement, and then we're going to talk about how that really directly plugs into what we're seeing now and how to navigate the sort of ever-changing landscape of internet culture as an e-commerce brand. I think it's really important to be aware of what is going on outside of just in trending ad styles, because I think I said this last week, I'll probably say it this week a bunch, and I'll say it next week a bunch, but the goal should be head into 2026 and do not follow trends, but rather set them for yourself. I think brands who can best distinguish themselves are the ones that I saw win in 2025 and will continue to win into 2026. So that is all the context I'll give. I think we should just get right into it. Like I said, I have had a lot of Christmas cookies today, and I am ready to talk about art history. So the Great War, or World War I, is not the most typical or I guess normal place to start a conversation about modern internet culture, but it is very relevant to Dadaism and I think understanding what's going on the internet right now. So I'm going to start us off in 1916, which is when Hugo Ball and Emmy Hennings, who were artists in their own right, but also a married couple, they founded the Café Voltaire in some neutral Switzerland. So something that's really important to note about Hugo and Emmy is that they were massively disenfranchised and they were reeling, like most people at the time were, from the impacts of the Great War. So they founded the Café Voltaire as a form of protest, not only against the war itself, but against the ideologies such as nationalism, conformity, capitalism that led world leaders to the point of the Great War. At the Café Voltaire, really anything could be considered art, and that was the entire point. So the Zurich Dadaists were laser focused on upheaving the ideas around what art was and what it could be, again as a direct protest against ideas like nationalism, conformity, capitalism. So it was like, where is the line? Let's find the line and continuously cross it, was sort of the idea of the original Dadaist sort of founders. One founding member I've always been very interested in is Tristan Tzara, who was a Romanian poet and performance artist who really admired the work of futurist artists. And what's so interesting is futurists were like pretty fascist in their nature. And so it's always so interesting to me that someone who was so ingrained with this movement, this artistic movement around net new ideas and finding a new way to approach society, they were so deeply entrenched and had so much admiration for folks on like what feels like the complete opposite side of the spectrum. And I think it's really interesting to me that Tristan became such a mainstay in the story of Dadaism and how it was founded, when again, like a lot of his sort of heroes and artists that he really did admire held such different political beliefs than what we usually associate with this group of artists. I think to me it highlights a really relevant point that comes back a little bit in this episode later, which is that when we look to create more chaos in order to make sense of the chaos that's already surrounding us, we do end up with a really mixed bag. And at the time, you could only work within the confines of your like geographical location. So without the internet, you could only really come to understand the points being made by those around you. But today, when we dive into chaos to make sense of chaos on the internet, anyone can go on the internet and post things. So I think it's a really important thing to keep in mind, like I said, for later in the episode. But let's keep talking about the original Dadaism art movement here. And let's keep talking about the Café Voltaire. So it kind of continued with artists experimenting with various types of performance art, mixed media art, sort of anything goes, again, was the sentimentality at the time in Switzerland. And eventually what I think is really interesting is Hugo and Emmy moved into the Swiss mountains after founding the Café Voltaire, essentially sort of leaving Tristan at the helm of both Dada and this sort of burlesque spot. They were very like spiritual people, so I think they were just looking for bigger meaning, which is why they originally started the movement and also why they just moved into the Swiss mountains, which, to be honest, I'm close to doing every day. Maybe not the Swiss mountains, but some mountain somewhere. I don't know if I would move to mountains. I think about a lighthouse. I think that would be very up my alley, but also very cold, which is not up my alley. Anyway, in 1918, so a couple years after we actually founded Dada as an art movement, Francis Picaba arrived in Zurich. He spent a ton of time between France and New York and was just sort of like a cool guy in the art scene. He was an artist himself, and he also published a art magazine. He was half French, half Cuban, very wealthy, just like really cool vibes. Like, I honestly could not imagine the amount of aura you would have kind of ticking all those boxes as a dude in 1918. He was really living the life. But because he had the means to travel, it meant that when he was introduced to Dada in the original shape and form, he could then take it to the other sort of big artistic HubSpots of the world at the time, which I think is really interesting again when we think about having the internet versus not having the internet. The movement of Dadaism and the ideas behind it only spread because this one guy happened to be in Switzerland at the time and he happened to enjoy what he was seeing. He began writing about Dada in his magazine. And one quote I found really interesting is he said, "Art must be unaesthetic in the extreme, useless and impossible to justify." I think that's a really interesting insight into how he felt about art and the art world and why Dadaism would have appealed to him. I think what's so cool about Dadaism is that it can hold a lot of people within it, because obviously it started as a protest against very political ideologies, but it can also be a bit of a protest against the art world itself, which is, I think, sort of where Francis was coming in. But yeah, I find figures like him so interesting when we talk about art history, because when art is a career and you come from an exorbitant amount of wealth at the time, I think it's so interesting to know what people's points of view are when that's their background and it comes to art. It's like that viewpoint is just so specific, and you're not necessarily someone who is creating out of necessity at that point. And we'll sort of get into some people who were creating out of necessity. And it's rather a career and a sort of social status to be an artist, which is so interesting to me. That could be a whole other pod, to be honest. But I really wanted to highlight Francis because obviously back then we needed someone to move this movement and do so in person because we didn't have really any other way to do it. And that's how people connected ideas back then, obviously, is talking with peers and with other people. So you needed these figures, these really well-connected folks in the community to carry these ideas and movements beyond their initial roots. It was through the spreading of his word in New York that we got Marcel Duchamp, my favorite Dada artist, who founded this ready-made style that, to me, and I think to a lot of people, really defines Dada as a movement. Basically, he takes something, famously once a urinal that he bought just from a store, and he said, "This is it. This is my art." And what I love about ready-made art and Marcel Duchamp in particular is that it really does boil down the entire hypotheses of the movement to single pieces, because it's really easy to look at a urinal on a pedestal and debate for hours whether or not that is a piece of art, which I think is it's just so cool. It's so heavy metal when you're able to, again, take this really big idea of what is art, who's allowed to make art, who's allowed to claim what they've made as art, and you just let people sort of experience the thesis for themselves. I think that is really cool and my favorite type of art. So that is why I really connect with Marcel Duchamp. And I think also, like I said, a lot of people tend to associate that urinal or the bicycle wheel with the movement because they are really contentious pieces, and it is really easy to debate over and over again, is this a piece of art that I'm looking at? And why do I care about a urinal just because it's in a gallery? It's very fun. Quickly, let's talk about how Dada made its way from Zurich to New York, as I just mentioned, with the birth of Marcel Duchamp. And then it also moved to Berlin. And Berlin Dadaism has a much stronger intensity to it, in my opinion, because of the environment in which that art was being created. Berlin at the time was obviously going through a revolution. So there are really undeniable tones of different political beliefs. And there's a really, again, just undeniable energy to the type of work that was being produced, at least that's my opinion, in Berlin by the original set of Dadaist artists working there at the time. Something to also note that I think is really important about the group of original Dada artists in Berlin is that, to keep it so real with you guys, the original group was super misogynistic, which is kind of crazy because I think as someone who's interested in art history, you kind of always expect some level of misogyny, but these dudes were really kind of taking it to the next level, and they were quite competitive, quite narcissistic, which again typically happens with artists. They're not always bright, shiny rainbows, but I think it's again, kind of interesting to think about the environment that bred that type of behavior, but it's made it like difficult for me, I'll admit, to really connect with the Berlin Dada artists. But I do think it's important to talk about because it so much exemplified the more political side of Dadaism, which is very important. Like Berlin in 1918 was a highly political time, so the art they made was highly political. I want to highlight off the back of that one specific style of art here that was really founded by the Berlin Dada artists. And I think it's important to, for the sake of some points later in the conversation about what is going on the internet right now. And so that style is Dada photomontage. I do love that there's a bit of drama that surrounds this style, which usually, again, happens when we're talking about a group of highly intense male artists working closely together, but there's a bit of drama around who actually created this style. But I think someone to really call out and pay attention to is Hannah Hoch, which is not a great pronunciation of that name. Obviously, as we've kind of said the backdrop, she really struggled to get the credit that she deserved, but I think it's worth kind of mentioning her background because I've always just personally found this really interesting. And she was sort of part of this original group, but often gets sort of forgotten about and left to the wayside, but she was so fundamental in the Dada photo montage creation story that, again, I think is really important to chat about her today. Because this type of collage art was so particularly important for artists working around the time of Dadaism and also Surrealism, and we see it pop up now and now again. Like, collage art is a very specific art form. And what I think is very interesting about Hannah is that she was actually trained as a pattern maker, and she had this really, truly rebellious attitude towards art and also towards life in general, which I think is really cool. And so I think it's so interesting that if you take the idea of the sort of Dada photo montage, which is by and large taking clips and sort of your assets from like magazines, newspapers. And so you're really sort of dismantling the physical world around you and then applying it to further your own point of view. I think it is so interesting to think of her as someone who, was like a trained pattern maker and worked in textiles, because she's almost doing like the inverse in the work that she did with the photo montage style. I've always just thought that was really cool, so I thought I would share. But yeah, I think that the idea of photo montage is, again, really interesting, and we'll talk about it a little bit later when we start talking about what's actually going on with internet culture right now. But yeah, just keep in mind that idea of like physically dismantling the media that you've been given and then putting it together in such a way that, again, just furthers your own point of view, I think is really relevant to some of the things that we see happen on the internet today. But we will talk about that later. This is a very brief history, like I mentioned, so we're going to scoot right along to talk about what was going on with the Dada movement in Paris, and we will do it very quickly because it wasn't huge. Most Dada shows ended in like protests and riots in Paris. What I think is really interesting and what I wanted to sort of bring from that time and place is that one emerging figure in the scene and ultimately the wreckage that was Parisian Dadaism was the poet André Breton. So when I think of André Breton, I think of like the beef that Frida Kahlo had with him, which I do think is like a really good time to start thinking about the overlap between Dadaism and Surrealism. And yeah, just thinking about who Andre was, which was, he was known for being a relatively sort of somber, serious, and very ambitious artist. So I think it's very interesting to see someone who wasn't shy about what they wanted to sort of get out of being an artist, come into this movement where, we're trying to deconstruct what it means to be an artist and what it means to be a successful artist. It's really very interesting. Like I mentioned, I know him best from years of reading about Frida Kahlo and seeing how much she did not like this man. She once famously said, I love this quote, I think it's really funny, "They sit for hours in the cafes warming their precious behinds and talk without stopping about culture, art, revolution, and so on and so forth, thinking themselves the gods of the world, dreaming the most fantastic nonsense, and poisoning the air with theories and theories that never come true. Shit and only shit is what they are." So that's intense, that is an intense view that she held, but I think it, again, is a really interesting mirror to some of the conversations we see today, which is why I wanted to include it in this very brief history of Dadaism. Something that I also think is really interesting about Frida Kahlo and Andrew Breton is that she once said that she never knew she was a surrealist painter until he went to Mexico and told her that she was, which I do think is a really, the way she phrases it is incredibly interesting. And I think it kind of amplifies the point she made before, which was she was an artist who was just doing for the sake of doing. But there was this movement later on in the course of Dada where things were really shifting. Same with the surrealist art movement. Things started to shift in a way that moved us away from those original hypotheses. Again, you think of someone like Marcel Duchamp, obviously so famous and integral to the movement. And yeah, the concept of taking a urinal and plopping it in a gallery is pretty risky and something you only do, I think, if you're truly inspired to move that conversation forward, where at the end, here in Paris, you start to see people who, are really using the movement to make a name for themselves as an artist, which I think is an important, differentiation. But back to Frida Kahlo, back to my, I would say, bias towards her, and the vibe that she had and the kind of attitudes and ideas she upheld about these sort of theory-based artists in the surrealist movement and then bringing it back to Dadaism. I do think it, again, perfectly encapsulates a lot of people's sentiment around modern internet culture, which is why I thought this was kind of a good place to wrap up and move into talking about what is going on today, because this isn't a art history podcast, although it could be. Why not? I do really want to plug this into what is going on today and kind of fast forward us to 100 years. I would recommend, though, that was such a brief summary and just hitting on some points that are more relevant to what is going on the internet today. But if you are interested at all in art and culture, I do recommend really double tapping into Dadaism, because I think it is, it's just a really fun, cool time and moment in art. And I think it's a great foundation to lay for yourself, to even just start thinking about what is art? What does it mean? But yeah, like I said, let's flash forward to today, over 100 years after Café Voltaire. And what's so interesting is the very same ideas that they want to tackle at the Café Voltaire, nationalism, conformity, capitalism, are all being discussed today at a high volume, but through a new medium, which is obviously the internet. It's how you're listening to this podcast. It's how I do a lot of stuff. And before I get into it, I just want to say I love the internet. I do. I think it's really fun. I love watching YouTube video essays. I like hair tutorials on TikTok. I like being able to talk to my friends who live on the other side of the world and see little moments of their day sort of live as it happens. I did spend 8 years offline, and I like that. And now I'm posting on different platforms, and I like that too. I do like progress, I like culture, I love humanity, and I just like the internet. I think it's really cool, and I think it gives us these different fresh opportunities, and these different stages, I guess is the only word that's coming to mind, to have these conversations about these ideas. The other day, I was watching someone talk about chamber music and about how chamber music progressed and how, as we started layering harmonies, sort of prominent members of the church were freaking out because they thought society was going to crumble because of this really simple shift. And I do understand that as human beings, change is really scary. I understand that what was once outrage over layering harmonies in chamber music then became outrage over visible ankles, which then became outrage over motorized vehicles, which then became outrage over the internet, which is now sort of outrage over AI. So I do understand this, and I think it's really interesting. And I understand that what may seem silly and even futile to some girl with whatever the equivalent to a podcast is in 100 years, it's really real to me and you today. So I think it's still worth talking about and noting. So yeah, I do really want to explore this link that I'm seeing between the rise in conversations about AI and content created by AI, and also this sort of return to Dadaism isms across the internet. So I spoke about this last week a little bit, but let's dive into this idea that we are in an era of omnipresent brand right now, because I think it does play a key role in this return to Dada, and I think that it helps sort of strengthen this thesis by drawing some parallels from different points in history. As I mentioned last week, we are really full up on commentary about the death of the millennial brand. Like, we are all good. I think people talk about this because millennial is a bit of a buzzword on the internet. Everyone loves to hate on them. I've done an episode about millennials. I personally love them. Shout out to every millennial I have ever known and will ever know. I think they are really troopers. But obviously, talking about quote unquote the death of the millennial brand, it does get views and it does get engagement because it's just a topic that everyone likes to dogpile in on. And I also think people have been a bit shy in naming the current state of brand in our lives, especially as advertisers, because it tends to feel a little bit icky when we start to really take a sober look at where we are today. But I don't mind that. So let's talk about it. I have been defining this omnipresent brand era as a period where conformity is providing comfort in this state of near constant surveillance. And I don't mean like surveillance state in a really spooky way. I think it's just interesting to reflect on the way that we all kind of exist through our phones and through cameras, and how much surveillance and capturing of ourselves we do compared to other times in human history. I have done a lot of thinking and very practical application of this theory in the past couple of years. And just this idea around how do we harness digital spheres into physical circles, meaning I've really strategically looked at how to move media mix beyond just a feed and out into the real world, because that is where I think brands really can win. Like shares, impressions, ROAS, it's all fine and dandy, and it's what I do like all day, every day. But I have started to really focus on how to strategically branch away from that and create a brand that is just worth talking about on sort of a whole other plane of existence compared to a lot of other e-commerce brands. So what I think is so interesting is, instead of us as customers now interacting with a brand, we've really seen this spike in brands completely engulfing customers. And I think to like that no face meme, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Spirited Away. It's one of my favorite movies. But just this idea of like really like consuming everything around you, I think is what you see now from brands, and almost what has to happen to be successful. Like, I've seen this trend where we have stopped really delineating the difference between what is personhood and what is being a consumer. Like, you are represented by that pair of like Pit Viper sunglasses, or you are completely represented as an individual as the like Labubu or a keychain, like little trinket of choice that you make. And there's so much more weight put on these things than there has been before. Obviously, you know, where you shop and what you wear, all these things have always been a way for us to signal to one another what type of people we are, what we enjoy. Some of it's like just stylistic preference, but I think that things just move so fast today. And they so much more intensely revolve around the brand, not the product. So it's like, are you still using that Laneige lip treatment? Now everyone's using Summer Fridays. Whoops, no. Everyone's using the Dior lip oil, and then it moved to Rhode. Like, things like that happen so quickly and so like violently in a way that the rapid turnover, I think, in brand rather than products, it stops a consumer from really being able to develop tastes, which is an important part of the journey for all of us to really discover, like, well, what do I like in a lip product? It's now rather like what lip product is trending, which I think is a really like interesting erasure of counterculture. It's a really interesting erasure of preferences. And like I mentioned, it moves so quickly that I think all of us, myself included, sometimes have a hard time even understanding that that is what's happening. But yeah, it's been something that I've been working on, how to like apply this to actual success for brands and how to maintain relevancy when, like I said, brand is everywhere, is omnipresent right now. And so this is where we are, in my opinion. It feels sometimes a little like a bummer to think about, but I can see these little like Dada-like protests starting to pop up, which I find very interesting. Again, as someone who really likes art history and history in general and culture and sociology, I think it's really interesting to compare and contrast where people were right before Dadaism sort of started to take hold and where people are right now in our own history, and poke at the similarities, because I think it can help us, like I mentioned, really understand how we have to operate right now as brands, but also start to prepare for this future, which might be a little bit more challenging for folks if we lean too far into this idea of conformity and omnipresent brand. I do honestly think with the rise in AI content and AI conversations, I think that the average person just spends way more time these days considering their own humanity. And so I think this partnering of hyperconformity and these genuinely critical conversations that we're having around what it means to be human, I think that that is really fueling the return of the spirit of Dadaism. Because if you look at, again, like where we've been, I mentioned this last week, but like Rode having phone cases that you can kind of slip your lip balm right into, like that is absurd in sort of the opposite way of a piece of Dada art. It's like you are taking something that is a brand and you're making it so much part of your day. You're looking at it all the time. It is always present, always watching you. And so it's little things like that that I think we have gotten very comfortable with and we almost yearn for in a way, because that does tend to happen when things on a sort of global political scale get a little bit kooky and crazy. We do search for that comfort. But I do think because we're seeing this like rise in conversation about like, what does it mean to be a human being? The juxtaposition of those two things, I think, are creating these like sparks and flashes of Dadaism. So it's like, what is art? What does it mean to be a human? What is advertising? You know, if everything can be summoned in a moment with little to no human intervention, it really does start to matter. Like, what is art and what is advertising if we can do it really without a whole lot of human intervention? And then what is brand? Like, what is a piece of content? What are we doing here anyway? Like, what is the point of the internet? It all gets really, really interesting, which again is why I think that we start to see these really absurd takes and these absurd trends happen in the modern internet landscape. I think that Dada challenges you both as an artist and an audience, which is important to keep in mind if we're thinking about a cultural return to this style of art, which usually if we are, you know, we don't exist in a vacuum as advertisers. So if something's going on culturally, especially in the art world, it's going to touch what we do as advertisers and brands. So I think that point is really, really important. It's going to challenge both you as an artist and an audience. So it's going to challenge both you as a brand, but also as a consumer. And, you know, this is so silly, but I love it. It's like, it reminds me of Duchamp, of ready-made. Like when you see something like 6'7" take over, that is a ready-made meme. What is even funny about it? Why does it exist? When do you use it? What is the point of view of that meme? There's really no answer to any of those questions that anyone will ever agree on. And that is the exact same as putting a urinal in an art gallery. You know what I mean? It's like, there is no rhyme or reason, and that is why people like it, and that is a direct tie-in to what Dada was trying to achieve as an art movement. And I also think, I was mentioning this earlier when we were talking about photomontage, but I think of like the drag path edits that people make of, you know, different things that really like touch on these fundamentally human stories. I actually don't know. I think it's like a 21 Pilot song. I don't want to guess. This is really embarrassing. I don't know. But it's like this song, drag path, edits. If you know, you know. But yeah, you see them about like global warming. You see them about, you know, the creation of art itself. And it really does remind me of the Dada era photo montage. I think they're, first of all, obscenely well crafted. People who make edits on TikTok are so crazy good at their craft. I've never talked about this, but the way I consume Hunger Games edits to this day is absurd. It's like the way that they can take media and then a song, sometimes it's trending, sometimes it's not trending. It's like, who's even thinking of these songs? And create these like net new pieces. It's like the extract and then reassemble idea behind that original movement of photo montage. It's so cool, like just pairing various types of media to create a vessel for your point of view is so impressive. And like, especially the way that specifically Hunger Game editors are doing it. It's like, whoa, who taught you how to do that? It is so cool and impressive. I love it. But yeah, what I believe is starting to happen is it is a bit of a form of protest to the massive push to conformity. And I think that massive push to conformity was really driven by this large scale adoption of social platforms. And it's become so embedded in our culture. But I do think we're moving towards this new period, even beyond our sort of foreseeable next dip into Dadism of romanticism. I'm a romantic at heart, so that does excite me. But I do think before we get that, there is this like demand for an awkward period, which is usually fueled by an art movement like Dadaism or Surrealism, where, you know, we're all in the midst of this angst of not knowing what is going to really happen next. And so I think that like painful and slightly annoying continuation of these same old conversations, I do think it makes a lot of sense that modern internet culture, specifically meme culture, is kind of following the same framework as some of these big, absurd movements in art. I think, like, as humans, when we take something that is so large and feels so impossible to dissect, instead of ignoring it when we dive deeper into the chaos, that is when we get these, like, really, like I said, awkward, absurd eras of art and creation where it's just like impossible to explain to someone what 6-7 means, but I know what it means and I say it. So it's like, yeah, one of those things that like, if you exist outside of this period of time in history, it's not going to make any sense, but it makes perfect sense when you're in it. So that was a lot. What does that even mean for you as a brand or a brand operator? I said this so often throughout Q4. What is the line? I said that constantly to myself and also to one of the brand directors that I work with very closely. And then I think, like, does the line even exist is what I was subconsciously asking. And I've talked a lot about strategy on this podcast before and about understanding your segmentation and your personas and also your channel mix. And that work is really fundamental in executing what I am about to describe, which is why I started last week with the message box, because I don't want you guys just like going nutso and being weird on the internet and expecting it to work and build the type of relevancy that I've achieved, because it's not going to. So I'm trying to like truly give you guys the tools and the thinking and like a bit of the framework into how to do that. I will say if this is like a net new area for you, or if you also don't like know how to take what you have in terms of segmentation and your personas and to apply it to something like channel mix or apply it to something like paid media, you can reach out on the Pilot House website, fill out a lead form, we can chat directly. I won't talk about Dadaism, or I will. It kind of depends on what your vibe is. We can talk about different moments in our history as well, but we can also just talk about creative strategy and like what it means to apply these things to what I'm about to say. But yeah, I wanted to make that disclaimer again because you can't, like I mentioned, do this work successfully if you don't have that foundation. And if you don't have that foundation, like we are getting to a point in time when it's too late to start putting it down. So I would urge you to really start thinking about it and really start like making a game plan to get to a point where you can start to do what I'm going to kind of close this episode off with, and then what we're going to talk about more next week when we dive into Norman Rockwell, which will be really interesting and fun. But what I have done and what I am still doing and actively testing and seeing a ton of success with is I'm just really stress testing the lines of what an ad can be. And I'm doing it in a way that is absolutely designed to meet my customer base exactly where they are today. And I think what's really interesting is I'm finding this like net new freedom and ability to create content at scale. That's like a really tactical takeaway from this. But because I've done this work and now I've opened up myself and the brands that I work with to this idea that like we should start testing the extremes of like what are we as a brand and what are ads, and really applying a lot of the principles that I have kind of talked about and also just learned myself about Dadism, really, like I mentioned, pushing the boundaries and doing so in a way that is almost prescriptive to every layer of my personas, and really thinking about channel mix. So it's like taking all this knowledge that I have about what type of ads work where, what type of messaging people want to hear, and then pairing it with this freedom that comes with really studying movements like Dadaism and Surrealism and partnering those two things together to create something net new. My biggest piece of advice, like I will say this again every episode of this series for 2026, is 2026 is not the year to continue relying on following trends. We talked a little bit about AI in this episode. It is so easy for the brand that's like biting at your heels. I think that's something people say about competitors. It is so easy for them to immediately make the ad that you've just put out that is performing well. But if you know who you're talking to, you know what they want to hear, and you trust yourself enough to have that conversation of like, what is the line? Where is the line? Does the line even exist? Then you won't have to worry about people replicating what you do, and you also won't have to depend on what other people are doing and seeing success with and replicating that for your own brand. Like I mentioned, I don't think that is going to work anymore because everyone is so empowered to create content at scale. You need to make high volumes of content still, yes, but it needs to be better than ever before. And I have been saying that for the past like 6 months, and I haven't really been able to like fully, I think, articulate how to do it. And this series is an attempt to do that in a way to, like I mentioned, actually give you the tools to like start the work, because it is really important. And if you want to be relevant, as we are, currently sitting in this omnipresent brand era, and, we're seeing the last couple of years this like conformity based on consumerism and this idea of community being really important, like that work still needs to happen actively. And then you still need to be kind of keeping one eye on the future as well and thinking if things are going to continue to get more and more absurd culturally and within art, I'm going to have to get more and more absurd as a brand. So how am I going to do that? I do think you can do both at the same time by really applying some of the principles that we chatted about last week, some of the principles we chatted about today. And yeah, I think it's really interesting, right? It's like, our work as advertisers is like, can we look and find ready-made angles and pieces of content to sew into the current zeitgeist to ultimately create our own rapport with our customer base? It's so, like I've been saying this so much, but it's so important, and it's such like work worth doing, especially like I mentioned, I'm not trying to like freak you guys out, but in this landscape where like brands were launching, like, I'm pretty sure this is still a soft number, like 30% more content this year than ever before. So it really doesn't matter anymore if you can just churn out a bunch of like quick pieces of creative. It's not going to ultimately get you very far. So yeah, I think it's really important to, first of all, like I mentioned, know who you're talking about, which is sort of what we talked about last week, and what we've talked about before. And then it's really important to start thinking about, testing the boundaries and really figuring out like, where is the line for your brand? What is the most fun you can have? What is the most non-ad that you can create? And starting to think about things much differently than you have been. Because like I said, 2026 is not the year to keep ripping off trends that you see. It is the year to start creating trends and building that hyper relevancy and loyalty through your content and your brand. That was a really long yap about art, about AI, about, I don't know, I think I mentioned pit vipers at some point in there. That was a long combo about a lot of things, but really important. And yeah, I had so much fun doing this episode. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out and drop a comment. Please make sure to give the pod a rating and subscribe. You can also reach out on LinkedIn if you have any questions. I know we went through like a ton of stuff today, but yeah, I think it's really important. And I do really want to see brands doing cool stuff in 2026 because I don't know, it's fun for me to see people doing cool things. And also, this is sort of the recipe book for how I saw a lot of wins in 2025. So I want to share the recipe with you guys. As I would share recipes for my Christmas cookies, bring it all back. That is truly the episode. That's the end. I'm going to go eat some more cookies. I will talk to you guys next week where, like I mentioned, we will break down Norman Rockwell, his work in both art and advertising, and how it represents sort of exactly where we are right now and what we should be doing as brand operators. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you guys next week.